In your research, you have argued that history matters, especially in regards to the perceptions of refugees, of host communities, and of policymakers. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about this linkage to the historical social ties of refugee flows in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey, and how this relates to the current Syrian refugee crisis.
Yes, I've argued that history matters, particularly in this region. I'm going to say the Levant, so we're talking Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Turkey. And the reason I say history matters is I really feel that the strength of the social ties in the region are very much derived from the multi-ethnic nature of the Ottoman Empire, which existed in the region for more than 400 years and only really ended less than 100 years ago. But during particularly the late stage of the Ottoman Empire, ties between people were less important in terms of territorial base. They were horizontal ties. So an ethnic group, for example, I would say Greek Orthodox Christians would be found in what is today Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in parts of Anatolia, and they would all be tied together through a system that was called the millet. These were the ethno-religious minorities, if you want to use that term today, of the Ottoman Empire. They had a certain element of self-governance, but what was important was the strength of the social ties and, of course, economic ties. And so they were widely dispersed within this region that we think of as the Levant. With the current crisis that we are seeing, I'll call it the Syrian civil war now, although it didn't start as that in 2011, you have huge numbers of Syrians who've come into this country. Nearly 30% of the population in this country are displaced Syrians. I've got to be careful about the terminology we use. And it's really surprised the world. It's surprised Europe. I mean, can you imagine a country like the United Kingdom, which has a population of about 64 million, suddenly receiving a displaced population of 20 million and coping? Impossible. But I think that the reason why Lebanon has managed so well is that the strength of the social ties and the economic ties between the numerous ethnic, ethno-religious communities of Syria are also found in Lebanon. You have Druze in Syria, you have Druze in Lebanon, you have Greek Orthodox Christians in both countries. You also have families who are both Muslim and Christian. They've split at some point, or they've ended up having different branches, some of them in Syria, some of them in Lebanon. And you also have a number of families who have land, particularly in the Bekaa Valley, in the areas around Zahle, Baalbek, Shdora, which are the sort of the remnants of their ownership before Greater Lebanon was created during the French Mandate. I've forgotten the exact date, I think it's about 1923. So you have very, very strong ties, which need to be taken into account in order to understand why things are working, why there is such an immense civil society output to help these displaced Syrians. And I think the international community, particularly the young international humanitarian aid workers who are assigned to Lebanon, often they come with perhaps a little bit of experience in a refugee camp in Africa, for example. And they think they can take their experience from Africa and apply it here in Lebanon, and it doesn't work. So they are often faced with really a serious learning curve. They often speak in the kind of language we used to hear in the 1980s when refugee studies first became popular. One of the most important message of the early studies in the 80s was to recognize that you cannot impose aid on people, that you have to allow people some agency, that you can't see them as a sort of a passive victim. But certainly the young humanitarian aid workers haven't understood that when they first arrived, and they've had to step back and reconsider how they approach those displaced in Lebanon.
In your research, you have found that Turkey, working largely outside of the international humanitarian aid regime, has had a far more humane and practical approach to the refugee influx. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the Turkish policy and the response to the refugee influx from Syria, and how it has worked in this sense outside of international humanitarian framework?
Yes, I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about history before I answer that question, because a lot of people think that the humanitarian aid regime really began in 1951 with, post-World War II with the Convention on the Status of Refugees, or perhaps after First World War with what we call the Nansen regime, the Nansen passport, which was devised in order to help Russians fleeing the Bolsheviks get into Europe and to start working, and also the Armenians to be able to move around Europe. But actually, the first refugee code and the first refugee commission was again formulated by the Ottomans in 1860 to deal with the 2 or 3 million Muslim Crimeans who were displaced after the Crimean War, and then later on the Circassians and the Chechens and so on. So the Ottomans have had long experience dealing with large refugee flows, and I do believe that the Republic of Turkey still had knowledge of those lessons. And when it came to dealing with this particular crisis, the Turkish government actually refused the assistance of UNHCR. They felt, and I think they still do feel, more of a European country than a Middle Eastern country. You know, the Ottoman legacy, the Ottomans felt themselves part of the Comity of European Nations. And so their answer was that we know how to deal with mass influx, we know how to look after large numbers of people who are displaced. And they certainly did. You know that one of the largest NGOs in Turkey the acronym is IHH, is as large as Oxfam in the UK, and they do a lot of international work in Africa and Southeast Asia. They respond to earthquakes and hurricane disasters and so on. And they were asked to do something for the first wave of refugees or displaced people coming in from Syria. And so in 2012, they set up 25 refugee camps along the southern border, but near towns and cities. They already had a sense that it was important to allow those displaced people access to towns and cities. So these camps were all rather small in size. They were sort of not this megalithic kind of camps that the UNHCR was setting up. And they were set up in such a way as to allow people really the ability to go out and work, to allow children to go to school. So they had within the camp straight away primary school as well as secondary school. And they also hired Syrian teachers as helpers. Because of the education system and the curriculum, they couldn't actually certify the Syrians, but they allowed them to take part and to work. So basically these camps provided Syrians with an opportunity to live in dignity, to find a way of sustaining themselves, even though within the camps their health care was looked after, the education of their children was looked after, the food was it wasn't through food aid, but it was through what I'm going to call cash transfer onto ATM cards, so they could purchase what they felt they needed from the supermarkets that were subsidizing food within the camps. And there were so many community facilities that within a very short period of time, those displaced felt very at home within the camps. They allowed refugees to go back to Syria if they needed to check on elderly parents, because very often the elderly won't leave, or to bury someone that had died. And because there was such a long waiting list for people wanting to get in, that they limited the period of time that you could be away to 3 weeks. Otherwise, you'd lose your particular accommodation. However, the UNHCR felt that these camps were very expensive. The UNHCR also felt that Turkish approach, which was to provide care to everybody, not to try to distinguish between the most vulnerable, that they would get more aid and so on, but to just give aid across the board. That went very much against UNHCR policy. But what's quite interesting is that the Turkish approach really allowed the Syrian refugees to survive in dignity. However, at this point, only about 10 to 15% of those Syrians in Turkey are in camps. The rest are self-settled in towns and cities, particularly along the southern border. In fact, some of the towns have more Syrian refugees than native Turkish community members. So it's been a very expensive exercise, but it's been an exercise that seems to have worked. There's been really very little criticism of that camp structure. And Following on from the camps, now the Turkish government, it took them a little bit of a while to get their head around it. They've really now begun to promote education, and first 1 or 2 years of intensive language training in Turkish, so as to allow Syrians access not only to the primary school, the high school, but also they do have access to free education at university. So that's one big plus. The other big plus is that Turkey is the only country that has implemented a domestic asylum law, which applies to Syrians as well as Palestinian refugees from Syria. Anybody who comes in from Syria, that law applies to, and that's health, education, and also the right to apply for a work permit.
Can you compare this Turkish model of refugee crisis response to that of Jordan and of Lebanon?
Well, the Lebanese response, and for well understood political reasons, was not to allow the UNHCR to set up large-scale refugee camps in Lebanon. And so the situation in Lebanon was really quite organic. What you had was somewhere between 300 to 500,000 Syrian workers in Lebanon anyway, some of them seasonal workers in agriculture, some of them in construction, but basically bringing their families over with them. So you had suddenly a growth in numbers of Syrians from maybe 500,000 to 1.5 million. All sought asylum or refuge with contacts that they already had in the country. So a caretaker in an apartment building in Lebanon probably would have brought his own family over because he had been a caretaker in that building for many, many years, a Syrian caretaker. He might have even offered accommodation for another family that he knew from the same village. The point is that Syrians came over and they already knew where they were going to go. If they were Palestinian refugees from Syria, they generally went, they joined family, or they found some sort of a kinship link. But people basically went to places where they had a network, normally social, normally kinship network, but it could have been through long-term employment. Eventually, over time, I'm not sure the exact number, but certainly there was something of over 1,000 small settlements of Syrian displaced people throughout the country. I would say perhaps the largest numbers were in the Baqa and in the north, in the area around Akkar and so on. And the local communities really came out in strength to help the refugees from Syria, and eventually the international community also began to come in and help. But the international community has been really quite slow about extending its services. I think it took them 2 or 3 years before they began to do any kind of cash transfer. But a lot of that had to do with the nature of the government, and there was a period when I think there was no government, and so they couldn't get permission to actually commence their activities. I mean, that part of the problem with the international humanitarian aid regime is it has to work along with the wishes of the host government. So in Turkey, the Turkish government said, no, we don't want you. In Jordan, the government said, we don't want camps. You're going to have to find another way, which eventually they did. In Lebanon, in Jordan, it's quite interesting because originally the Jordanians were quite happy to welcome the Syrians as their Arab brothers, but there was a certain point when the government got very nervous. There are a lot of rumors that abound that basically the tribal leaders of the north got very nervous with the number of their kinsmen coming and really stretching the Arab tradition of hospitality, and they asked the government to ask UNHCR to set up a camp. And so by the end of 2012, the UNHCR began setting up a very large camp in the middle of the desert border between Syria and Jordan, an area that now is known as Zaatari. And they allowed that camp to fill up until the point that it reached over 160,000 people, unstructured. The shower, toilet facilities were all in the center of the camp, which meant that women and children particularly had to walk quite a long distance in order to be able to shower or use toilet facilities. No policing, no gendarmerie, and as we all know, there was really an outbreak of sexual violence, I'm going to say gang culture, and so on. Eventually, Zaatari camp was reduced in size. People began to leave. They began to buy their way out or to get sponsorship. And that number is now down to 180. But still, for many Syrians who are self-settled in the towns of Irbid and Amman and elsewhere, they look upon being sent back to Zaatari as though being deported. or being sent to prison. So not very popular solution.
Can you tell us about the implications of the lack of education opportunities for Syrian children? What are the greatest challenges, and what would be your policy recommendation in this regard?
Yes, I think education is extraordinarily important. And although there certainly was an effort to accommodate Syrians in the schools in Lebanon and in Jordan initially, the numbers became so large that it even reached a point where I think in Lebanon 60% of school-aged children were not in school, and that was over 2 or 3 years. Same happened in Jordan. In Turkey, it wasn't quite as bad because in Turkey, Syrian NGOs began straight away trying to set up schools and using, because of the struggle over what kind of curriculum to use, they used something that's called the Libyan baccalaureate. This is the baccalaureate that was approved by the Arab League, but in Libya at the time. The problem is not only one of trying to develop a curriculum, but it's also of creating the manpower, having the teachers, because although in Turkey, Syrian teachers were allowed to teach, obviously because of the language problem, in Lebanon, Syrian teachers were not allowed to teach, and the same in Jordan. So it was how to have enough teachers. One effort was tried, which was to set up a second rotation, afternoon rotation, just for Syrians. But what they found in Jordan is that that created really strong social discrimination, because if you only had the Syrians in school in the afternoon, there wasn't really a chance to try and create harmony between the Syrian and Jordanian pupils. It was like segregation. Lebanon, I think that the Lebanon public school system was not particularly strong to begin with. And so the money that's coming in now, which is working to build up the public school system, is going to take 2 or 3 years before it's going to actually take effect. So one of the key recommendations that we've been making at the Refugee Studies, based on an earlier study that we did, is that we really have to, one, promote formal education in any way that we can. But until that's possible, we have to try to find a sort of balance between trying to promote formal education here in the region, but also offer as many scholarship opportunities for high school as well as for college and university in Europe and in the US, not just post-high school. I know there's a very big program in the US to take Syrians on scholarship to complete their university education, but I think we have to look at the high school as well, number one. Number two, we need to look at non-formal education. We have large numbers of youth that have been out of school for 3-4 years. They're technically illiterate now, and they need to go into what we call adult education or literacy courses. 2 years literacy training, and they can get back into high school very easily and graduate. So we need to look at literacy training, and I think we also need to look at technical training. There are many youth who perhaps would prefer to just do IT work, learn how to do programming and so on. Perhaps you don't need to have a high school certificate for that, but you can have a technical certificate as well as apprenticeship programs. And I think that needs to be rolled out throughout Lebanon, throughout Jordan, throughout Turkey, and as well as have opportunities in Europe.
In order to give a bit of historical perspective of refugee crises facing this region, can you talk a little bit about previous experience of Iraqi refugees and Palestinian refugees and what we can learn from those scenarios?
The Palestinian issue is a very touchy subject, particularly in Lebanon. It was the case, I think, all across the region. Again, people thought they were going to go home in a week or 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, what have you, and it didn't happen. And certainly in Lebanon, I think it was in 1953 or 1954, the Christian Palestinians and some of the wealthier Palestinians were given citizenship to sort of balance the population makeup of Lebanon. But most of the others were left in camps, and over the decades, their relationship with the government was severely dented, if I can put it that way, through the history of the Lebanese Civil War and what have you. So the only real lesson that I think we can look at in terms of Palestinian refugees is that we set up a special agency, a special UN agency set up to deal with initially less than 1 million people, and that agency had no political element to it, but it was one which provided with education and welfare. And the agency, UNRWA, really educated the first generation of Palestinians and then the second and the third, and gave them an opportunity to be able to go abroad, work, and send remittances home. So you could say that that agency really saved Palestinians and kept their hopes alive for a return someday, but created an educated population that can compete in the 21st century. The Iraqi crisis is also very interesting in that we tend to think that huge numbers suddenly crossed the border from Iraq into Syria and Jordan in particular. 2003, we know it didn't happen at the time of the Anglo-American invasion to unseat Saddam Hussein. The real flow started around 2006, 2007. But the important thing is that actually Iraqis had begun to flow out of Iraq from around 1980. So at the time of the first Gulf War, Iraqis started flowing out into Syria, into Jordan. These are mainly the wealthier, middle class professionals, the artists, and so on. And after 1990, with the sanctions imposed against Iraq, the numbers, it became more than just a trickle, it was a steady stream. So by the time you got to 2006, 2007, the Iraqis had really good ties in Syria and in Jordan. So again, they completely pushed aside any effort to put them into camps. They refused to be encamped, and they went straight to the cities, mainly Damascus, but also Aleppo and Amman. Very few came to Beirut. I think it was mainly young Iraqi men came to Lebanon, actually with the hope of somehow migrating abroad. But in Syria and Lebanon, what we saw was that you don't need camps in order to provide for refugees. And UNHCR, you have to give it credit, it stepped back, it took a deep breath, looked at the situation again and decided, okay, we'll register mobily. You don't have to come into a camp to register. We'll register people. We'll deal with their needs as the government wants us to. And of course, the Syrian government, because it really didn't want to allow too many NGOs to come into the country, insisted that any aid for health and education had to go directly through the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, so that all services to Iraqis came via the government ministries, and it was provided equally to the host, the Syrian nationals, as well as Iraqi. And that's the model that we already learned in 2006, 7, 8, 9, that we're now talking about, having to do that when you provide assistance to displaced people, you have to also provide assistance to the host community, particularly as the displaced will often gravitate to the poorer areas of a country where rents are lower, food is cheaper, and so on. So it's only natural that the aid should be provided for both the host community and the displaced.
Thank you so much, Don Chatty. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. Your insight has been very valuable.
You're very welcome. Thank you.